Hi, my name's Cherry Johnson, and I've lived here at Bayview for 3 years. Well, this whole issue about risk and LGBTQ elders has been a important issue for me for many years. I did some writing about it in graduate school years ago, and did a lot of work with gay men during the AIDS pandemic, and just have thought a lot about aging while queer. And there are a lot of risk factors involved. And I think about um, people who are most at risk. That really there are three generations right now of queer elders. There's some of that World War II generation that are still around. And those are folks that have lived their lives 100% closeted. By and large, there's a few outliers, but most of them have. And then there's the silent generation, the ones that are kind of in their 80s now, who grew up learning to kind of stay in the background. So being closeted was a natural for that generation. And then there are the baby boomers whose natural stance was to yell a lot, to talk about what's wrong, to try to fix things, to be out and public and loud. And in communities like this, all three of those come together. And they're all at different kinds of risks for different kinds of reasons out in the community and in communities like this. So I think about that. I think about, the oldest folks and how isolating it is, because people who came of age in the 30s and 40s and 50s even, who had to be closeted their whole lives, their social supports, their communities were usually small groups of like-minded people who would get together socially in each other's homes. And as those folks die, they are left more and more and more isolated without a community. They didn't necessarily relate to a larger gay community or to a movement or anything like that. And the silent generation is kind of split. The front end silent generation lived similarly to that, has lived similarly to that. And the back end silent generation, some of them associated more like with the baby boomers. So there's a split there, but a lot of really isolated people. I think of people I know who were teachers, who are in their 80s now and had to be closeted their entire lives, even though in their later parts of their teaching career, it was okay to be out. But you don't make that shift when you're 55 years old to suddenly say, okay, now I'm going to be an out proud gay teacher. You stay in the closet, and that becomes a habit. And as you retire and you don't have any kind of a work community, maybe a larger gay or lesbian community, that can be really isolating, and depression and loneliness are really common in those kinds of situations. And then, there's the baby boomers who may be used to a large community of activists, but are no longer able to be activists. And that's isolating. So there's whole kinds of reasons why people are, or why queers are at risk as we age. So another thing that I think about is balance issues. So I think about that here at Bayview. Right now we have very few gay men, but a really large group of lesbians living here. A few years ago, it was a little bit reversed. So, it ebbs and flows depending on who's around and or our lifespans are. But I know that for the gay men who are living here right now, that's isolating to not have a larger community, and that's important. It's even more critical for people who are outside of a community like this, that they might lose their whole community of support. So balance issues. Another thing is, I can't imagine being the only trans person or the only bisexual person or the only person identifying as genderqueer in a community. I have a friend who's 83, I think, who lives in a senior community, and he identifies as genderqueer, and he wears skirts and dresses, and people don't understand that at all. And my heart breaks for him, because what must that be like, to be alone in that, to not have people who really get you on a deep level. So that is something that I think about. Then another thing I think about is economic disparities. And this is one of those places where lesbians and gay men don't always come out on the same end of things. So lesbians who have either lived alone or been coupled for years are operating on one or two women's salaries, and we all know that women's income is less than men's to start with. So lesbians are less capable as a large group of living in places like where I'm living. I feel really lucky to be here. I mean, I was a career social worker and community organizer. I never made a lot of money. I'm lucky. I am really lucky to be here, but I have a lot of friends who couldn't in a million years afford a place like this. And my heart just breaks for them. And in some ways, I feel kind of guilty for being able to be a part of this community when they can't, because life is very isolating for them. Another thing I think about is what I call subtleties, that we live in a time when lesbian and gay issues have been very prominent for the last couple of decades. And the community at large has really come a long way in understanding with a broad paintbrush what the legal issues are and what the discrimination is like, or has been like, for specifically lesbian and gay men. And now we're looking more at trans folks and genderqueer folks. But there are all kinds of other issues that are more subtle. So for instance, people may totally respect the fact that I need to have equal rights, or that I have the right to marry a spouse of the same gender. But they may not get that there are all kinds of cultural aspects to being a lesbian that make my life different than theirs. They may not understand that when they put on a soundtrack of songs from my generation for an exercise class, that is not my music, that it's heterosexually based music, that it's not what I listened to, that I found alternative women's music that I listened to that is the soundtrack of my life. That's a subtlety that most people don't get. I've actually made playlists for myself and told people, if I'm lying there dying, or if I'm unable to speak for myself, this is what I want to listen to. I have a story. When I was working in long-term care with, I was working in this particular case with a gay man who was in his 80s, who had AIDS-related dementia. And in his dementia, which is often the case, he had very low inhibitions. And so when staff would come in to provide care for him, instead of grabbing at the women, he grabbed at the men. And the male providers in our facility were so off-put by this and insulted, and how could he do this to them? And I would need to work with them about, this is what women have put up with for years, and this guy is not in love with you, or is not making a pass at you. This guy has dementia, and he has no control over the fact that he's grabbing. Distract him, do all the things that you would do to distract somebody. And, we would work on strategies. So again, a subtlety. It's not something somebody thinks about in healthcare, the way some things play out, how somebody's going to be when they have dementia. I want to talk a little bit about spiritual care, because I think that's a really critical thing. So for LGBTQIA+ elders, many have been completely alienated from organized religion over the course of their lives. Not all. I'm personally involved with a church that's a great supportive community, and I love it. But for a lot of people, they're going, how can you possibly have anything to do with a Christian church? Don't you know what they think about queers? And, they go on. And I have to go, well, it's not that kind of a church. But for a lot of people, those hurts are so deep and so traumatic that, they don't want to hear about it. They don't want to have anything to do with anything spiritual or religious. They're just done. And what happens is when those folks get, especially to end of life, it's not uncommon at end of life for the beliefs that we had as young children to come bubbling up to the surface. So then there's this dilemma. Am I supposed to believe that stuff? Is something wrong with me? Am I going to hell? Does God hate me? Have I lived my life wrong? All the stuff that had been resolved, they think, over the course of their lives by a long shot, by decades, suddenly is there again. And if there's not cultural humility in the spiritual care department of people who know how to say, who know how to ask the right questions, know how to find the resources of someone who can speak the language of that person, their religious language as well as their queer language, to help them through that part, then they don't get to have a good death. And to me, that's just so incredibly critical. So just a couple more things, one is that I want to be sure to mention that within the LGBTQIA community, there are subcultures, right? There's the lesbian subculture, there's the gay male subculture, there's the bisexual subculture, there are subcultures of BIPOC queer folks, and there are subcultures of disabled queer folks, and etc. But the thing is that for all of these subcultures, there are particular risk factors related to aging. I think about many of the BIPOC queer folks that I know who often feel a sense of isolation from both of their communities. From the gay community, for being BIPOC, they feel isolated, don't have as large a community. From their communities of color, where there may be either not homophobia now maybe, but there was enough in the past that fear is still there and that reticence. So that's really, that adds a whole other layer of isolation risk. Disabled lesbians and gay men have a very small community of support and have a hard time accessing one another for a number of reasons. And often are, because disabled folks are often so invisible to start with. And unless they have a strong partner advocate or something like that, it's easy to not even notice that they're queer because they're only seen as disabled. Yeah. So one other thing that I wanted to, just pause. Yeah.
Great.
Okay. So one other thing that I don't want to fail to mention is that I have a really strong belief that people who go through trauma and discrimination in their lives, if they get appropriate support along the way, which in my case, I got from the community, and from therapists and from all kinds of people, but the larger lesbian and gay community that I was very active in really helped me develop a sense of advocacy for myself. And because of that, I feel like I have stronger coping skills and more resilience for all of the things that come at you when you're aging. And I saw that in the gay male population that I worked with when I was doing AIDS social work, that people, once we learn that we can overcome one thing, then we have the skills for overcoming something else, or at least for coping with it effectively. And I think that it's really important for us as lesbians and gay men to remind each other of that. And I think it's really important for the communities in which we live to recognize that and to celebrate it. So when I was looking at retirement communities, I had a friend, another lesbian who I'd known for 45 or more years, and we decided to look for a place together. Both of us were single, and we wanted to have somebody to have our backs just in case there was homophobia or whatever. We just thought, why go alone if we could go together? So we came to Bayview for a tour, and one of the first things I noticed when we were touring around the hallways is that a bunch of people had these human rights coalition stickers with the equal sign posted outside their doors. And what that said to me is lesbians and gay men live here. And that meant the world to me. All of a sudden, I just relaxed and realized that there would be other people like me here, that I would be reflected here. So not only was I going to have a friend that I came with, but there were going to be other people that I could make friends with probably easily. That was fantastic. Then shortly after I moved in, I was asked to write a bio for the monthly newsletter, a new resident bio. So I'm a writer, and I wrote this really long bio. I mean, I just decided, and I wrestled with how out should I be in this? And I just decided, let it all out. So I talked about my gay rights activism. I talked about how I liked to be, what I like to be called. I just put it all out in writing. And then I just thought, well, I'll wait and see what the response is. And first off, nobody said anything. And then one guy in his like late 90s came up to me and said, I know we're going to be friends because we both like folk music. And that was the only response I got. So I just thought, you know what? I guess people aren't uncomfortable with what I said, or if they are, they're so uncomfortable they're not going to tell me about it. And my experience has been really great. I mean, I've only ever had one person say anything homophobic to me, and that person has some dementia, and I totally forgive her. She doesn't know what she's saying, so it's okay. She's just she's living in another era, and I get that. I've been a community educator my whole life and an activist for LGBTQIA plus and women's rights and all kinds of other things. But I really love spreading the word, spreading the good word. And so when I offered to do a panel discussion and PowerPoint show a couple of years ago on queer then and now, I just jumped at it, and I jumped in with both feet and really enjoyed it. I loved the interactions. And the really cool thing was that so many residents came up to me after we presented that to our internal community here at Bayview. And they said, I have a great grandson who used to be a girl. And then we would get into this whole conversation about trans issues and what they grew up with and what they think now and how much they love their great grandkid and how wonderful it is that they support them like that and that they try to understand as much as they can. And it's really opened up a dialogue I've noticed in the larger community that's really good. And this year we're going to do a panel on aging while gay for some of the folks in the larger gay community to get acquainted with Bayview, and for the folks on our marketing, on our wait list who are LGBTQIA plus. And I'm really looking forward to that because, as you can see, I'm passionate about aging while gay issues. We have a affinity group here that meets once a month. We call it the LGBTQ affinity group, but really it's lesbians and gay men only. And we started out in the first meetings talking about being gay and gave our coming out stories and talked about how our families received or didn't receive us and all the sort of horror stories and passionate, wonderful stories from our earlier days. And then we ran out of that and we were sick of it. And now we just tell stories, so we'll say, I think the last time we met or we had grandmothers was the topic. And we all told stories about grandmothers. And it was such a beautiful way to get to know each other. But the thing about that group is that it's a place where I can really let down and know that there are people here who share my culture. We're not all the same, but there are aspects of our personal experiences that are very similar. There are emotions that we've felt that are very similar. There are types of discrimination we may have experienced that are very similar. It's a way to be that's really great. Now, on the flip side of that, I have heard comments from heterosexual residents who say, I don't see why you need a group. You're just like us. But to me, that's like dealing with racism by saying we're all the same. So let's not talk about it. We're not all the same. LGBTQIA elders have some experience and some trauma-based fallout that heterosexual counterparts don't have. And we need places, not necessarily to talk about them as much as just to be with each other and know that we're sharing that in common. You know, in the same way that a group of widows can sit at a table and just be in one another's company and really get each other. That's what we do in the LGBTQIA affinity group. So I just want to say it's really great to live in a place where during Pride Month, there are rainbow banners outside and inside, and I feel appreciated and welcomed. And I know that people who drive by know that queer elders live here, and that makes me really happy. So I really appreciate having this opportunity to speak to this group of leaders because I think that there are great things happening in inclusion for LGBTQ elders. Those who can afford to be here, I will repeat again, because I don't know what we do about the other folks. It really breaks my heart. But one of the things that I think we could do better, and I expect this true in all communities. I have a couple of friends who live in other communities, you know, who recognize this too. So as I age, I'm in my mid 70s right now, and I figure as you know, if I am lucky enough to live to 90, I'm going to have mostly millennials and Gen Zers taking care of me. And there is a rift between millennials and Gen Zers and older queer populations. Because millennials, God bless them, have brought the whole issue of LGBTQIA rights and gender identities out into the open. And the Gen Zers have taken that and run further with it. And it's so exciting to me to watch that. At the same time, there is some shaming that goes on. And I don't know if everybody's aware of that, but there's shaming that goes on between younger generations for my generation getting it wrong. I mean, there have been books written about this and about how, you know, we didn't get trans issues right and we didn't get gender, you know, non-binary, genderqueer issues right. And they're right, we didn't. You can only fight so many battles at one time. And the battles that we fought were mostly for lesbians and gay men. We knew at the time that bisexuals and transgender folks who were in the movement were marginalized at that time, and that was problematic. And so they're right in the way they criticize that, but it gets shaming sometimes. Our language isn't the same. I'm perfectly comfortable with the word queer and with the LGBTQI plus two spirit, all of the entire spectrum, because I've dealt with this for years. But for most of my peers, they're like, what do those letters mean? You know, just like it's true in the heterosexual community. So, so there's criticism. The criticism from the elders, the elder LGBTQ folks, toward the millennials and Gen Zers is you didn't live through the trauma that we lived through. You don't know what it's like to be afraid to go to work, or to be afraid to live with someone of the same gender and it be found out, or to go to a bar and be jailed for it. You know, there are experiences that we have had that they have not had. And so we're saying you don't understand us, and they're saying we don't understand you don't, and they're saying you don't understand us. There's a little bit of a standoff, and I don't think we talk about it enough. I think that there needs to be healing about this in order for care to be completely effective for LGBTQIA residents in leading age communities. You know, I guess my main take-home message on all of this is no matter how good we get at helping LGBTQIA elders reduce the risk of isolation and loneliness, the most important thing is to never stop, is to keep asking the questions, how can we do better? What are we missing? And to listening to the stories, because in the stories are the answers. All right, so I've had 100 careers in my life, but I started out being a teacher. I taught English and drama at the junior high level. And if you can handle a room full of 8th graders, you can do anything in life. And then I ran a church camp up in the mountains where you had to snowshoe in the wintertime, and ran retreats, and that was great fun. And then I was the executive director of the first organization in the country that served the psychosocial needs of lesbians. It was called the Lesbian Resource Center, and it was here in Seattle. It was started in the early 70s. And I was the executive director there for a few years. And I also did at that time a lot of work with the Church Council of Greater Seattle on the task force of lesbians and gay men, and lots of speaking gigs around schools and universities and Kiwanis clubs, and you name it, anybody who wanted to learn about anything gay, churches, synagogues, etc. Then I did community organizing for a lot of years around lesbian and gay issues, gay rights. There was an anti-gay initiative in Seattle in 1978 that I was really actively involved in, mostly doing public education. And then out of that, and then not long after that, the AIDS pandemic started, and I began taking care of friends who were dying. And out of that developed a desire to go into AIDS social work full time. So I went back and got a master's in social work and went into AIDS care for the rest of my career. And I worked mostly at an organization that had a skilled nursing facility for people at end of life, at first with AIDS. And then over the years, we also took in people with neurodegenerative disorders who also had very complex care. And I worked a lot with people living on the streets with substance abuse disorders and mental illness, and also living with HIV/AIDS. So that was kind of my career path. Since I retired, I did a Campanis placement, Campanis is an organization that places professionals in nonprofit organizations that need help. And what I did was I was running retreats for seniors and retreats for women at a place called Rainbow Lodge up in North Bend. And a lot of my volunteer work that I do now is focused around my church. I've started a small group thing going on at the church where we have groups on everything: educational groups, political action groups, fun groups, groups for different ages, so it's just places where people can find a sense of belonging within the church community. And here at Bayview, I'm active in a number of things that we've already talked about, plus the library committee and some craft stuff, and my floor.
I didn't know you're part of the, I didn't realize you're part of the library committee.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for that synopsis. And Cherry, are you comfortable giving your age?
Yeah, I'm 75.
Could you, so I can recapture your intro? Hi, my name is Cherry. I'm 75 years old and I've lived at Bayview for blank. Can you capture that
Sure.
in one shot?
Hi, I'm Cherry Johnson. I've lived at Bayview for 3 years. I'm 75 years old.